The air in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Brentwood on that crisp October morning of 1993 carried an unspoken chill, one that had nothing to do with the encroaching autumn. It was a cold that settled deep into the bones of a city, accustomed to perpetual sunshine, a cold born from the sudden, inexplicable void left in its wake. This was a silence that spoke volumes, a narrative woven from the threads of what was missing, what had been violently taken, and what would forever remain just out of reach. If you're watching on TV, point your phone's camera at the QR code on the screen and subscribe to the channel now. Here, you'll find real stories that almost no one had the courage to tell. Before the headlines screamed, before the flashing lights of news vans illuminated the sprawling estates, there was only the routine, the mundane ballet of daily life in one of Los Angeles' most affluent enclaves. Rob Reiner, a name synonymous with a certain brand of Hollywood power and influence, had carved out a life that, from the outside, appeared to be the epitome of success. His sprawling estate, nestled amidst manicured lawns and towering hedges, was a fortress of privacy, a sanctuary from the relentless glare of the public eye. Yet even within these gilded cages, shadows can lengthen, and the most meticulously constructed facades can begin to show hairline fractures. Reiner, a man of formidable presence and a reputation for an exacting nature, had a life structured around the demands of his career and the intricate web of relationships that sustained it. His days were a blur of meetings, scripts, and the ceaseless negotiation of creative visions. But beneath the veneer of professional accomplishment, there were currents of unease, faint ripples in the placid surface of his seemingly perfect existence. Those who knew him best, or thought they did, recalled a man often consumed by an intensity that bordered on obsession, a drive that could be both inspiring and isolating. His marriage to his second wife, a woman of striking beauty and quiet determination, was a focal point of his personal world. Their union, celebrated in the glossy pages of celebrity magazines, projected an image of effortless glamour and shared ambition. Yet behind closed doors, the dynamics were more complex, more fraught with unspoken tensions. There were whispers, rarely articulated in polite company, of Reiner's demanding nature, of a possessiveness that could sometimes stifle. Friends noted a subtle shift in his wife's demeanor over time, a growing reticence, a carefulness in her interactions that suggested a landscape of unspoken rules. The household staff, a revolving cast of assistants, housekeepers and security personnel, were silent witnesses to the daily rhythm of the Reiner home. They observed the meticulous order, the precise schedules, and the occasional jarring disruption. A raised voice echoing from the study, a sudden, inexplicable change in plans, a tension in the air that seemed to thicken with the setting sun. These were not overt signs of discord, but rather the almost imperceptible shifts in atmospheric pressure that precede a storm. One particular detail, often recounted in hushed tones after the tragedy, was Reiner's growing preoccupation with security. While understandable for a man of his stature, it had, in the months leading up to that October, escalated to an almost paranoid level. New alarms were installed, surveillance cameras became a constant presence, and the gates to his property were reinforced with an almost military precision. He spoke of vague threats, of feeling watched, but the heavy midday sun of December 14, 2025, did nothing to warm the interior of the Brentwood estate. Inside, the silence had shifted from the contemplative stillness of a Sunday morning to something dense and suffocating. At approximately 3:30 p.m., the front door was opened by Romy Reiner, who had arrived after a massage. Therapist reported being unable to reach the couple. What she found in the master suite was a scene of clinical, terrifying precision. Her father, Rob, lay still, the victim of what the medical examiner would later describe as multiple sharp force injuries. The initial shock was so profound that Romy fled the house, unaware that her mother, Michele Singer Reiner, lay nearby, having met the same violent end. The timeline established by the Los Angeles Police Department suggests that the fractures in the family's reality hadn't just appeared. They had splintered the night before. On the evening of December 13th, the Reiners had attended a Christmas gathering at the home of longtime friend Conan O'Brien. It was a festive environment, but witnesses would later describe a flicker of darkness following the family. Nick Reiner, the couple's 32-year-old son, was reportedly behaving with a frantic, unsettling energy, approaching guests with disjointed questions about their fame. A heated exchange between father and son was witnessed in a quiet corner of the party, a hushed but intense rebuke from Rob that seemed to be the final thread, holding their tenuous peace together. By the early hours of Sunday, the Brentwood mansion had become a silent tomb. Forensic investigators noted the absence of forced entry. The security system, which Rob had meticulously upgraded out of a growing sense of paranoia, had not been triggered from the outside. The violence had been internal. There was no signs of a struggle that suggested a long, drawn-out fight, but rather a swift, focused series of actions. The coroner's report would later indicate that both Rob and Michele died within minutes of the attack, the life leaving them in the very sanctuary they had built to keep the world at bay. As the sun began to set on that Sunday, the investigation moved with a cold, mechanical speed. Detectives didn't have to look far. At 9:15 p.m., in the shadow of the University of Southern California campus, some 15 miles from the blood-stained carpets of Brentwood, officers spotted a figure that matched the description of the Reiners' middle child. Nick Reiner was taken into custody without incident. He was carrying a red backpack, and security footage from a gas station earlier that day showed him moving with a hauntingly calm demeanor, purchasing a drink just hours after his parents' bodies were discovered. The initial forensic sweep of the crime scene and a subsequent search of a local hotel room uncovered what the lead investigators called physical evidence that couldn't be ignored. Specifically, significant traces of blood were found in a room Nick had occupied briefly after leaving the estate. The technical narrative was beginning to take shape, a sequence of movements that placed the son at the heart of the house during the window of death, followed by a calculated exit. Yet the most disturbing detail didn't come from the forensics, but from the initial police interviews with those who had seen Nick that day. They described him not as a man in the throes of a breakdown, but as someone who appeared strangely emptied, as if the act had drained every drop of humanity from his system. As the charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder were officially filed, a single chilling contradiction emerged from the evidence. Despite the brutality of the scene, there were no signs of a ransacked home or stolen valuables. This wasn't a crime of greed, it was a crime of intimacy. The investigation began to pivot toward a deeper, more unsettling question. What final word, what specific look, or what long-buried resentment had finally acted as the catalyst for a son to turn a blade on the 2 people who had spent decades trying to save him? The aftermath of the tragedy left a vacuum in the cultural landscape, one quickly filled by the sterile, clinical language of the courtroom and the heavy silence of a family shattered beyond repair as the investigation deepened into the weeks and months. Following that dark December afternoon, the focus shifted from the how to the why, peeling back the layers of a domestic life that was far more turbulent than the public could have ever imagined. The narrative of the perfect Hollywood family was replaced by a grim exploration of a generational struggle with addiction, mental instability, and the suffocating weight of a father's legacy. Rob Reiner, the man who had spent his career directing stories about friendship, love, and the human spirit, had been living a private screenplay of constant crisis. Friends and close associates began to speak, with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion, about the decades-long battle to stabilize Nick. It was revealed that the young man had spent years in and out of prestigious rehabilitation centers and psychiatric facilities, a cycle of recovery and relapse that had drained the family's emotional reserves. The dark reality that finally emerged was not one of a single, explosive moment, but of a slow, agonizing erosion of the familial bond, where love had been replaced by a weary, hypervigilant form of tolerance. The legal proceedings, brought to light a series of communications, texts and voicemails sent by Nick in the 48 hours leading up to the events. They were not the messages of a criminal mastermind, but the fragmented, desperate transmissions of a soul in freefall. He spoke of being erased, of feeling like a ghost in his own father's house. Psychological experts brought in by the defense pointed to a catastrophic break triggered by a lifetime of perceived inadequacy, exacerbated by the very real physiological damage of long-term substance abuse. They argued that Nick was no longer inhabiting the same reality as his parents, viewing them not as protectors, but as the architects of his internal misery. The social and moral consequences rippled through the community of Brentwood and beyond. For many, the case became a chilling cautionary tale about the limits of parental intervention. It raised uncomfortable questions about the intersection of fame and mental health. How the resources of the wealthy can sometimes buy temporary silence, but cannot purchase a cure for deep-seated psychological trauma. The public, once enamored with the Reiner name, now looked at the estate with a sense of morbid curiosity and profound sadness. The house itself, once a symbol of prestige, was now a monument to a failure that no amount of money or influence could prevent. During the sentencing, the courtroom was a study in profound grief. Rob Reiner's testimony was a heartbreaking account of a sister who had lost not only her parents but also her brother to a darkness she couldn't reach. The legal outcome, a life sentence without the possibility of parole, offered a conclusion to the state's case, but no resolution for those left behind. The final confession, though not always spoken in words, was written in the evidence, a realization that the most dangerous ghosts are often the ones we share a table with, the ones whose names we know, and whose pain we have tried and failed to carry as our own. Today, the gates of the Brentwood estate remain closed, the gardens beginning to lose their sharp, manicured edges to the slow creep of nature. The story of Rob Reiner is no longer just about the films he made or the laughter he inspired. It is now inextricably linked to a tragedy that defies easy explanation. It remains an open-ended mystery of the human psyche, a reminder that beneath every successful life lies a private landscape of vulnerability, and that sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that end in a silence that never lifts. The legacy of the Reiners is now a haunting tapestry of creative, light and devastating shadow, a reminder that the world we build for ourselves is only as strong as the unseen foundations of the mind. In the end, we are left to wonder if the tragedy was an inevitable collision of two broken worlds, or a singular moment of madness that could have been diverted, if only someone had recognized the true depth of the silence before it broke. The camera pans away from the quiet house, leaving the viewer with the chilling realization that the most profound horrors are not found in fiction, but in the quiet rooms where the lights have finally gone out. As the credits roll over the image of the now deserted mansion, one final thought lingers, cold and unshakable. We are all merely guests in the lives of others, never truly knowing the weight of the shadows they carry until those shadows decide to finally step into the light.